My grandmother, Florence, had lost her dad, Frank Bouffier, at an early age, sent off to boarding school, and then in her 20s just was a young lady around town. She didn't marry till she was about 30. Finally, she married Herbert Fitzpatrick. She met him through another person called Elvina Noonan, who was her sister, who had married into the Noonan family. And through that mutual introduction, they got married. Herbert was described on the marriage certificate as a freeholder, and he had some real estate business early on in the upper North Shore. Herbert's family, the Fitzpatricks, were from Queanbeyan, and then they'd moved to the Rocks, and then they moved to Newtown and Marrickville. They were pretty involved in Marrickville, the shoe business. So Herbert and Florence, they were a young married couple. They were living in Manly because they'd started a business. The business was called the Scotland Island Real Estate, and I'm not sure how it came about that Herbert had purchased Scotland Island, but this was the big dream of this young married couple, that they would develop Scotland Island. Now, unfortunately for them, they couldn't foretell that the Depression was going to come, and in the 1920s they thought that Scotland Island would appeal to people from Sydney as a holiday destination where you could play tennis, fishing, swimming and boating. And I think they put all their energies into try to achieving that dream. But unfortunately things did not go well for them. I'm sure they worked very hard at it. They went up to the area a lot. So they had a lot to do with Scotland Island, going backwards and forwards, trying to develop the island. And I think it was quite difficult for them. They had trouble with builders and supplies and the weather and bushfires, and they actually had a house on the other side of the bay, to my knowledge. When I was in my 20s, my mum and I would sometimes go over to the youth hostel to stay, and Mum pointed out a property that she said that they owned around Halls Wharf Way, and she told me that this is where the house was that we used to come to, but unfortunately it burnt down. And they had their boat, the Elvina, which she called the launch. My mother called that the launch, and they would go around Scotland Island and the various bays, and they absolutely loved it. And they also called Elvina Bay after Elvina Noonan, Bouffier, and other various places that they absolutely loved. While my mother and her brothers were little, we've got some pictures of them swimming in the various bays. That's how they learnt to swim, and that was a place that they liked to go to from Manly up to Pittwater all the time. I haven't mentioned also about the yachting, because they became very interested in sailing, and they were instrumental in establishing both yacht clubs, I believe, that are still there now, and we still have some of the trophies that have been handed down in the family. And my cousin has the Marshall Plate, which apparently is a very big race, and we've got some photos of them. My grandfather Herbert was the Commodore at one stage, and I think the secretary and maybe the treasurer or something. They were on the committee, and they had fundraising, and they're mentioned in the social pages. Like my grandmother wore attractive dresses that were sometimes mentioned in the papers. It must have been a bit of a good social scene to be involved in, and they promoted it. And they thought that Pittwater was the most beautiful place in the world to be able to do this yachting and have this great lifestyle. And they just loved it so much. But unfortunately, my grandfather also fell into bad health. He ended up dying at a fairly early age, in his 40s as well, and with all the problems and the depression. So I think they just fell into hard times. And then after my grandfather died, they had to sell everything up and move over to the south side. So my grandmother had to move to Lewisham, and she's gone from a person who had boats and had nice social events in the social and properties, and she went from that sort of lifestyle to having to run a fruit shop, a fruit and grocery shop, on a corner shop in Lewisham by herself, and raise four little children. So my grandmother, that's what she was left with. She took with her the tablecloths, the silver, all the things, and they still told the stories. My grandparents were married at Randwick in December 1923. They went for their honeymoon to Scotland Island. The family story is that while they were on Scotland Island, they went around and planned various streets and tracks and bays after various family members. And in particular, there's two that I'm really proud of. They named the parks after their mothers. So Herbert Fitzpatrick named Elizabeth Park after his mother, Elizabeth Fitzpatrick, and Florence named Catherine Park after her mother, Catherine Bouffier. When I was a little girl, I used to always hear stories about Pittwater and stories about my ancestors. My mother told me that my ancestors came from Germany. They were wine growers. They brought the grapes on the ship, the grapevines, to Australia. And then they became the pioneers in the Hunter Valley. This was in the 1850s. It was very hard for them. But they built up a very big wine business, and something that I'm very proud of. So Henry Bouffier had some children, and one of them was his son Frank Bouffier, and he also worked very hard in the wine business. He promoted the Australian wine industry and the Hunter Valley everywhere he went. And he had a very good and big business with the Bouffier wines. He went in international wine shows and won medals. And he went all over the countryside promoting his wine business. And eventually, Frank married a young German lady named Catherine Gattenoff. And the Gattenoffs were also from exactly the same area in the Rhine River. And also they were all Catholics. And Catherine Gattenoff's family were quite well known in Sydney. Her parents were married at St Mary's Cathedral, and she was a young lady who wasn't involved in the wine industry at all. However, she married Frank, they had children, and she supported him while he was developing his wine business called Bouffier Brothers. And I think things were going pretty well for them in the Hunter Valley. And they started a depot, a wine depot, they called it, in Oxford Street, Paddington. And the business was going very well, and they had their children and things were progressing very well. But unfortunately, Frank Bouffier died at quite a young age, unexpectedly. And so he had a long, sad death and left Catherine as a widow, which would have been very, very hard because she had the children and she had the wine business. I'm very proud of her, my great-grandmother, because she chose to continue with the wine business, and in those days women didn't do that sort of thing. I think she must have been a very strong woman to be able to run a wine business by herself. If you look at the wider scope, there was the temperance movement, and there was a lot of people against alcohol from religious movements. But she chose to keep running the wine business, and as a widow, she sent the children off to boarding school, and she concentrated on running the wine business by herself, which wouldn't have been easier. But she had her own style, and she liked to display the wines, and she still continued promoting the wine business. It's pretty incredible because I've got some newspaper articles which describes the Bouffier wine business that she's running by herself as the biggest wine business in the Southern Hemisphere. It's amazing. I think it would have been very stressful for her, but somehow or other she managed to keep the whole thing going, and it's a great source of pride to our family. And we've still got some of the wine trophies, and of course some of the stories continued on about these German people who worked so hard and kept going, and that she was so resilient to survive that with her little children. But I'm very proud of these women who had great resilience and courage and continued on to raise their family to be proud of.